So this is Richard Delevan. Welcome back to Wicked Problems. I am delighted to be joined again by Rupert Read. And we're talking on the day after the release of this first kind of legally required report from the Climate Change Committee here in the UK. And they were evaluating whether or not, the new government that's been in office for less than a year has done anything to improve upon the resilience and adaptation strategy for the UK to cope with. It looks pretty grim. Were you surprised?
But I was a little surprised. It was so harsh. It was so tough. I was glad that they made clear that they're profoundly unsatisfied with government progress on adaptation, and that, in fact, and this is a first, that they rate the overall level of achievement across all of these multiple sectors on adaptation, that none of them is the level of achievement good.
Yes.
It's very, very tough. They could have been even tougher in terms of talking about the potential results of this, the potential costs to the citizens of this. I think that they are, if anything, leaning on the side of being conservative and underestimating how bad the consequences could be in terms of heat-related deaths, flooding-related deaths, etc. in future. But in terms of their level of the assessment of government achievement, which is a very, very low level of achievement, I think they've got it spot on.
And then they just talk a little bit about kind of the barriers, to implementation and, what in particular communities face. It's something that you obviously decided to, take a turn and work specifically in this area and are setting up various initiatives to try to encourage, local communities to be able to make themselves more prepared. What are the kind of, does the report, to your mind, effectively address, what those kind of barriers are to implementation of these plans?
Well, I think that the key thing to consider here is the simple, basic fact of funding. We know that you cannot get where we need to get on any of this without adequate funding. Now, the government, in its response to the CCC's devastating report, said, oh, look, but we're spending this money on flooding. There's 2 points to be made there. Firstly, the amount they're talking about, a couple of billion, sounds quite a lot, but it just isn't compared to the vast scale of the problem. The word problem drastically understates really where we're at here. But the other thing, and this is in a way even more interesting to us in this climate majority project, is that you've got to also look at what the actual stuff that is being done, that is being funded is. Mm-hmm. And in terms of what the government is funding in relation to flooding, it's virtually all old-fashioned hard flood defences. In other words, reactive adaptation, purely merely defensive adaptation. The amount of funding that is available for anything worth calling strategic or transformative adaptation is asymptotically approaching zero. And we think this is very bad news indeed. The Climate Majority Project, we're calling for a real emphasis on strategic adaptation, and that would have to be concomitantly funded. What do I mean? Well, if we talk about flooding, for instance, right, as I say, it's virtually all going into old-fashioned hard flood defences. Where is the money that is going into programs of building social and psychological resilience to flooding and other hazards? Where is the money that is going into networks of citizen responders or citizen science in relation to flooding? Where is the money that is going into the restoration of peatlands and wetlands? Where is the money that is going into changing upland land management or land reform or making sponge cities? In other words, making the surfaces in our towns and cities porous. There is some, but it's an absolute, well, to coin a phrase, drop in the ocean compared to the amount that is being used for old-fashioned hard flood defences. So look, what's going to happen, Richard, over the coming years is that this amount of money that's being put into hard flood defences, an inadequate amount anyway, but this amount of money that's being put only into hard flood defences, those flood defences are in some cases going to fail. They're going to be overtopped. They're going to collapse, creating potential worse disasters than if you didn't have them. They're going to piss many people off and put many people off when they, for example, damage beautiful views and aspects in city centres, etc., which might sound a minor point, but you've got to actually think about how people live their lives and what makes life worth living, not only about sticking plaster solutions to these climate reinforced modern problems. And when people start to realize that merely reactive and defensive adaptation is not enough, then more and more people will be pushing for strategic adaptation, for the kinds of things I was naming a minute or two ago. And that's what we're pushing for already right now. That's where the forward thinking, the horizon scanning needs to be here. And insofar as it is absent, then citizens need to try. It's very difficult, but to try, as you were implying, to press ahead now, to protect themselves, to protect ourselves, including in doing what we can to start to bring about, for example, conversations with large landowners to alter the ways that that land is being used upstream, ways that are contributing very directly to the increased flooding hazards that we face. And one more thing to add to the list that I mentioned, which is really, really crucial, allowing rivers to be rewilded, to retake more of their natural courses, not building on floodplains. All of this kind of riverine management falls under the heading of strategic adaptation and, of course, ecosystem-based adaptation. It's very, very neglected. And I think that's one of the reasons why, although they haven't really talked about this as far as I can tell, although I haven't read the full report, I think that's one of the reasons why the Climate Change Committee are dissatisfied with what the government are doing.